13th, Critical Analysis of Film as Art and Politics Since Mapplethorpe, with Jason Leggett. Perhaps no other amendment has been as overlooked as the 13th Amendment. If you read carefully, pay attention to the exception clause. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except a punishment for crime. The big question that we have to consider in law and society is who gets to make that exception. Art has a way of both dividing politics as well as transcending politics. Here, in this letter to Robert Mapplethorpe, Patti Smith humanizes him. This is a man that the government, including prominent congressmen, and the law as a general abstract concept, had dehumanized and criminalized simply for existing, or, in other words, for living his life without harming anyone else in his pursuit of life, liberty, and property. The government concluded in Miller versus California that average was best, that average was entitled to life, liberty, property, and due process of law. They emphasized the concept that whether the average person would find something obscene. This is, of course, an unreasonable standard. 20 years later, in present day, you can see that there are dozens or more or different views of what is obscene. Average is no longer the definable concept or standard in a pluralist society. These are just several examples taken from the internet. As you can see, there's a progression here as politics has become a part of art and art has become a part of politics. Even commercials have to try to balance the difference between obscene art and obscene politics. And yet, our laws still promote conformity to one way of living or of seeing the world. Deviation from that norm is crime. And torture, killing, beating, jail, or other forms of violence are consequences of being different. This conformity can be tracked back to the 1950s and the quote-unquote American dream. There was a general ideal following the war that Americans were one type, a type that was different than those that they had fought against. The other image shows this kind of contrast, this idea that things can be many things, and that even things that may appear to offend one person could be sacred to another person. And yet, African Americans have consistently been othered. In the 13th, the director and rest of crew make a very strong argument that this is a linear or historical problem. This happened at the time of slavery, that African Americans were criminalized because they were not like white European Americans. This happened again during the Jim Crow laws, after the Civil War. And then, of course, today, the largest population in the prisons is still African American. This shows us that this otherness, this non-white or non-European American ideal of conformity can have very negative consequences in our criminal justice system and in law generally. We have to wonder whether law can continue to be simply a deviation from norms. When we think about what systems are likely to change, we have to think about how deeply embedded they are in social relations or in society. Prisons mean very different things to lots of different people. Some people look at it as a form of simply punishment, of taking bad people and giving them some kind of discipline. However, other people see punishment or prisons as a form of social control, as a way to get other people that are not like yourself to behave like you. Which systems are slowest to change are those that are deeply ingrained in some kind of historical narrative. Although prisons have not been a consistent in America, and in fact one of the reasons for declaring independence against England was that they used the prison system to punish people for different religious views, of course different sexual views, and even from being from the wrong part of the British Empire. So how do these narratives take hold of large groups of people? Why do some people believe these narratives while other people reject them? It's helpful to think about the theorists or those who write about law and society as looking at social relations that are attempts of power, control, and influence over different people. The point here is to emphasize that majority populations always have more power, control, and influence over minority populations. So if a majority defines behavior or lawfulness as a norm that's particular to their social group or their cultural group, then those who are not in that social group or majority will always be victims and targets of discrimination. To finish off, we think about the film The 13th as a way of explaining politics through the medium of visual arts. This, of course, is combining thought and digital tools that are available at a relatively inexpensive price to large groups of people, including minority populations. These new media change viewpoints. They provide different stories. They share information, and they mobilize groups of people. But perhaps most importantly, they humanize those who have been dehumanized. I return to the concept of Mapplethorpe being both a political and artistic figure because he used visual art to stimulate a larger political conversation that transcended himself. Most artists talk about this process of art being something more than themselves. And yet people still tend to talk about politics in a very personal and individualistic way. The way that 13th is able to change this individualistic or normal attitude is by taking logic, legal research, and examining the cases in which there is blatant discrimination in the court system and prison system. And the film shows there's a line of history beginning before slavery, through the Civil War, through the new Jim Crow, and finally, today. This historical narrative shows that a minority population, mostly black men, have been targeted by the majority population. They focus on politics in this film by examining both federal and state laws to show that it's not a one-time issue. This is not simply a problem of the South. This is not simply a problem of one or two people. And it certainly isn't simply a problem of just a small group of KKK or other white supremacist groups. This is a political issue that affects both Democrats, Republicans. It affects people who believe in the government, who want to see the government overthrown or changed, and affects even those people who believe in separation of church and state. All people in politics, the struggle for power, must recognize their own individual and group role in this political process. Again, the 13th, as an artistic endeavor, helps people understand this connection. This leads me to social relations. Dr. King talked about difference made legal in his letter from a Birmingham jail. This concept might be better referred to today as the politics of legal exclusion. It isn't a coincidence that African Americans were enslaved. It isn't a coincidence that they continue to be discriminated against today, especially in the form of the criminal justice system. This is not an issue of poverty. This is not an issue of simply retraining people or giving after-prison programs. This is an issue of social relations. There is a large enough group of people in the United States of America, and perhaps beyond, that believe that their political identity is linked to the exclusion of others. We have seen this in the treatment of Indian Americans. We've seen it in the treatment of women and children. And we have certainly seen it in the treatment of African Americans. Film, again, is a way to transcend this narrative. To dehumanize is to use a legal exclusion process. To humanize is to create an inclusive environment. And that's something that art can always do, although not always well. But in the 13th, they do a wonderful job of combining art and politics to help change the narrative and perhaps have a larger impact on policy. This leads me to my final question. Can storytelling itself help change group narratives?